welcome to a special episode of the Full Moon Show where we're going to kind of go back and take a look at Resistance 2's development and talk about it now. Guys, this is now, what, a year, almost 2 years later after release. Let's kind of go back to the very beginning. When you're starting Resistance 2, what was the first thing that you knew you had to do with Resistance 2?
Co-op. Simple. I mean, when we were doing our presentations for Resistance 1 in the very beginning, that was the number one question we got was, why don't you have online co-op? We had co-op, but people wanted to be sure that they could play with their buddies online.
Co-op was definitely a challenge. I remember coming in the very first sitting with Ted and having to ask me what my take on co-op was, and they wanted to push the mode in a way it's never been pushed before, and progression and replayability and getting more players in that experience than it has ever been before was definitely kind of the foundation which we started to push it into a kind of a new genre, a huge mode that theoretically could have been a standalone thing. I mean, I think that's probably the amazing thing about Resistance 2 is that each one of the co-op, the competitive, and the single-player mode, because they were so big in scale on their own, could probably stand alone as an independent game.
Let's talk about some of the other focuses, and we're going to get into some of the early decisions that we made on Resistance 2. But a good question from Devil May Cry on IG.com said, there seemed like you guys had a huge focus on water.
Do you remember the Fury debate?
Oh yeah. Well, it ended up basically becoming the most probably expensive lava anyone's ever made in games, right? It was we had places that had water and you couldn't go or you would break the game, and it was like, it sucks that you're sitting there shooting that thing and it won't die, but if you kill it, you can jump in and break the game. And at that point, I think it was just like, we've kind of painted ourselves into a corner.
Yeah, we had to make it invisible.
Yeah.
That being said, I still thought that they were very creepy enemies, and just seeing them slithering around and having them kind of circle around you when you're about to die, that was enough to keep me out of the water, regardless if they were invincible or not.
And actually, they were originally going to come out of the water too, like walruses, and we had a prototype that way. And
for a long time, they were actually crawling after you in Bay Area.
That's right. And why did we cut the Widowmaker? That actually, I don't remember why it was gone, but
Did we cut it? I don't think we included it, did we? I think was it ever part of the design?
No, it wasn't part of the design. Do you know why?
It too, like the Howler, was one of those enemies that was just so difficult to get working. The irony is that it basically used the same system as the Stalker. So Stalker,
which also didn't work very well for quite a while.
Actually, the Stalker started working 3 weeks before we shipped. I remember, yeah.
I think we must have at some point, if I recall correctly, because all this stuff is fuzzy, that biting off both of those at the same time would have diminished what we could do with one.
So some of this stuff that was working in Resistance 1, looked good, wasn't working until 3 weeks before launch. Why?
I'm happy to take this one.
Please.
So at the beginning of every project, we have a prototyping period where we go through and we try to figure out what's going to work and what isn't before we put a lot of effort into making final enemies. Well, with Resistance 2, that prototyping period, for the most part, was taken up by rewriting all of the code that we had just barely gotten done for ship on PlayStation 3. So we all bought into this because we didn't want to ship on the same code base. We knew that there was much more we could do with the franchise if we took the time to go back and clean up everything we just barely gotten finished for launch. And it paid off, however, at the expense of having to redo a lot of our enemies from scratch.
By the way, kids, we totally know what we're doing here. And we keep this started working 3 weeks before we ship. We know exactly what we're doing. Everything's under control. We're all good.
That's an interesting point, though, because, was Resistance originally a trilogy?
Well, if we want to go back all the way to the beginning, Resistance was a space opera. Now, we ended up with a story that involved time travel and, I think, flying ships through big holes in asteroids. And then when we moved back to Earth and decided to set it in this alternate 1950s universe, I don't think we talked about a trilogy. I don't remember.
I don't remember. I think we're just trying to get the first one done.
Yeah, that's true. We're thinking about PlayStation 3 launch.
Exactly.
First-person shooter. We haven't done this in a long time. Let's see if we can actually make a compelling story for one game, right? But just to qualify, I say this a lot in interviews. We don't ever set out to do a game where the story can't be continued. We want to create franchises and not just one-off games.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Jeremy Patrick asks on Facebook, how'd you go about choosing which sites and cities would be in the game?
I got a 2-word answer for that. Google Maps, pretty much. That was it. I remember plotting out how we would be moving across the country once we decided that we wanted to have the big scene in San Francisco.
It's literally just living on Google's server, like this
Yeah.
key piece of information about the game, and I was always just a little like, God, like I just hope no one ever like accidentally gets their hands on that or it leaks out somehow. It never did, but it was like really scary to go onto Google to access one of our documents at that time.
Actually, that's one of the most fun aspects, in my opinion, of beginning the game, is when you have a blank canvas and you start thinking about all the cool places you can go. And that's the approach we've taken for a lot of our games in the past. You know, when we talk about Ratchet, it's what planets would be really cool to visit.
Yeah.
And then, at least from my memories, we start constructing the story and the gameplay around that.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole Oregon thing, or sorry, not Oregon. It ended up being Scotia,
Oh, right. Well,
California. But originally we talked about Humboldt County, I think, in Oregon as one of our first settings because Marcus is from Humboldt County,
Yeah.
and he was like, "Oh, dude, the trees up there are amazing. We gotta do something with really cool forests." And he was right.
We talked still using the internal names because Scotia became Oric eventually because we couldn't use the name we couldn't use Scotia because it was like a company-owned town or something like that.
Yeah, the company owns the town and the name
of
it.
the town.
Yeah.
And we figured that out late too, right? It was
About
Yeah.
6 weeks before ship, something like that.
Yeah.
I remember there's a mad scramble.
tech name.
Oh, they still call it
scramble
Scotia.
of, yeah, that we can't call it that.
yeah, like changing art and level and all sorts of crazy
Yeah.
shit, if I remember correctly, way back then. So let's start with the art style, which is one of the first things he asked about.
I think we were less happy when R1 came out, and I think looking back, I think everyone's a lot happier with R1 with like a year or two of perspective than we were right after it came out. I think there were some negative comments about the sepia, it's too brown, it also made us stand out, I think. And I think you end up hearing a lot more negative voices. I mean, the people who are happy aren't getting on the forums as much going, this is the most awesome thing. There are some people like that, but the people who don't like things, I think, tend to be louder. And, you know, I know you've got a whole list of things. I think some of those are good decisions, but I think maybe in retrospect we wouldn't have changed quite so much.
Probably not. Yeah, I mean, people were very vocal about the game because there weren't many games to talk about at launch on PlayStation 3. So we took all those comments really seriously.
Yeah.
And it definitely felt like there was a push, a desire to see more color in the game. And we talked about that a lot.
I think it's a mixed thing because I do think it made us stand out more, but I also think we created some things that, you know, aesthetically are a lot, at least prettier.
Yeah, like the forest.
The forest in Oregon is a
yeah,
great
Chicago
example.
And the
Yeah.
Bay Area when you first come out and the
the
sky
bar
and-
scene with what were the motherships? Is that what we call them? Like raining down on it. It wouldn't have been as impactful in that sepia tone, I don't think.
The environment that we presented in Resistance 2 was 1950s America, and so we were trying to go back to the idea of this Kodachrome feel, where there are colors, and it's a really interesting palette where you're emphasizing some colors over others, but it's definitely not Super 8.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. But it definitely couldn't have been monochromatic or sepia tone and maintain that sort of 1950s America feel.
Got that postcard, postcard look. Yeah.
So, switching gears to competitive a little bit, and even this ties into co-op somewhat too, but I think one of the biggest challenges with that was that while we were rewriting all the systems, the multiplayer team spent a lot of its early time working on Resistance, Fall of Man patches and updates and things like that, and keeping that sustained. So how did that affect the multiplayer team going forward in R2 and affect the competitive modes?
I thought that they actually had a better start than any other team on Resistance. I mean, they were up and running very quickly.
I think
even
there were
though
fewer
they were
systems to actually rewrite for
Yeah.
multiplayer. We were looking for navigation, AI, and all that kind of stuff.
Right. And they had some really cool stuff early on. Skirmish mode was one of them, I think. We were experimenting with a lot of different things. And I remember some of the first battles we had in our gray box environments were just unmitigated chaos. You know, you just didn't know who was who. And,
Well, I think at that point, there was vehicles in multiplayer. There was all sorts of ideas at the time that were thrown around before we kind of settled. Like there was a lot of different iterations and prototypes and some stuff just didn't work very well at that point.
Which is par for the course, I think, in early development. Going from making games in 1 year to 2 years was an attempt to make it a little bit easier, but what we ended up doing was expanding the scope for our games. And so for Resistance 2, it had a massive scope, 60-player, multiplayer, 8-player online co-op, a really big single-player campaign.
13-hour campaign.
Yeah, and so we bit off a lot, and when we took into account the fact that we lost basically 6 months by starting over with our code base, it did create this frantic pace where we're all just trying to get everything in that we could. And as a result, there were parts of the game that weren't as consistently polished as other parts. And I think we learned a lot of good lessons on Resistance 2. Instead of saying from the very beginning, okay, we got 12 big ideas for this game, we're going to make them all work, and we got lots of people, so no problem, let's go.
Everybody run.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but I think it's super exciting. I think Insomniac's history, though, is frantically making excellent games.
Yeah.
And I think it's awesome. It's going to be awesome to see like what we're able to do with 3 years instead of, the Ratchet games were all made in 1 year cycles.
Yeah.
Now we've shifted to the 2 year, but even that's a small team and a big team. I think that seeing what we can do in 3 years is going to be fantastic.
So let's talk about one of the other kind of big things, because I remember the focus for Resistance 2 was a lot of the things we said were Hale and scale. We were trying to put the focus on Nathan Hale and tell his story, and we'll get to that in a little bit too. But there's also this big focus on scale, and not just scale in the levels, which we touched on, but boss battle. What did you guys learn from from putting boss battles into Resistance 2 and trying to make first-person shooter boss battles?
I don't think we learned anything new. We just got reminded how difficult boss battles are. That's literally. I think we delivered on scale for sure. That was the whole idea behind these bosses.
Leviathan.
Leviathan was a totally unique experience. Yeah.
You hadn't, I think, at that point seen anything like that in a first-person shooter. Right. Period. And I don't know if even to this point, I don't think you have seen any other shooter attempt something that big. Yeah. Maybe Gears kind of did, maybe in some certain spots, but not many games even try that sort of thing.
It made a good E3 demonstration, especially for the Insomniacs, who knew exactly what was going on as I was up there on the stage playing.
I'm Ted Price, President and CEO of Insomniac Games, and this is Resistance 2.
At the time, the Leviathan demo was carefully timed, so that if you messed up, everything would basically come to a grinding halt. And so I was up on stage, and we had no backup. It was basically me just playing through the demo, hoping that things were going to go well.
And talking at the same time.
And talking, yeah. And I got stuck on a couch, and I practiced this thing like 100 times, right? And practiced not getting stuck. And I got stuck on the same damn couch, and I was thinking, okay, I have about a second to get unstuck before the game basically doesn't crash, but ends. And it would have been the worst demo in the history of E3 had that happened.
And of course, everyone was in Ratchet, Ratchet conference room at the time watching Tag going, oh my god, oh, he's off the couch. She's off the couch.
I just felt bad for the environment artist you fired for that. That's not true. That's not true. That's a joke. The last question, I guess, for all three of you is, looking back on it now, how do you view Resistance 2, and how has it shaped, I guess, where you're hoping to go with Resistance 3? And you don't have to get too specific about Resistance 3 because we haven't talked about it much yet, but what are kind of the main things you learned and think about when you think about Resistance 2 now?
Wow. You didn't put that one on the list. I didn't think about that. You want to go first?
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, sure.
I think focus on a theme and make it work really well is something that I think we wanted to do with Resistance 2 in America, and I think we learned a lot more about how to do that well, and we're taking that ahead to Resistance 3. That's one thing I'll contribute.
And I guess if we're gonna say general, which is good, because the Resistance 2 story is really parallel in Resistance 3 story, which is, I would say that focusing on quality over quantity a little bit. I think we're definitely overscoped with Resistance 2, and I think we put out a great game, a massive game, like Jake said. Any one of those 3 game modes probably could have been a game, and yet we charged $60 instead of $180 for some reason. Go figure.
Yeah.
And but yeah, I think just kind of reining in the ideas a little bit and focusing a little bit more on quality instead of trying to do everything.
Yeah.
Jake, last chance.
Last chance.
Wax poetic.
I guess for me, Resistance 2 was really a great experience. I think that everybody was working on their own thing, and it really felt like we brought it together at the end. I didn't really get a chance to play a whole lot of single player until the end, but when I did, it was really a great experience. And again, we all had this scale, this underlying notion of scale, and that was something that I think permeated each of the modes and kind of gave a consistent feel throughout them that we were pushing size and scale. And I also think, we we intentionally pushed the limits of each of the modes, things that had never been done before in either co-op, competitive, or single player. So I think that is something that I'll always be proud of, as far as really not being content with the status quo and trying to do something different and really push the boundaries of what people expect.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The only thing I can add to that is I was really happy with how the whole Hale story turned out. I think that from the beginning we were wondering who this guy is, and we set out to make a character with an emotional arc that would create some sort of emotional connection with the person who was playing him. And then we, of course, ripped that emotional connection out at the very end. But to me, it was fully realized. And I hope players appreciated it.
I think, given the amount of questions we get about Hale and R3, I would say that came out. Because if people are asking and care, then that means that there was definitely some emotional attachment during Resistance 2, even though he's dead. Well, that's all for this special retrospective episode on Resistance 2. We'll be back soon with another interesting episode about something that we'll think up in the near future, because I don't know what it's going to be next time. But stay tuned soon, and make sure you check out the issue of Game Informer, which is the complete unveil of Resistance 3. So check it out, and we'll be back next time with another episode of The Full Moon Show. Later. A lot of fun. Yeah. Tyler Campbell says, 10,000 kills trophy. Grrr.
This is where I dive under the table and say, not me.